we've got a couple of speakers for you tonight. We've got Sahar, who's in Palestine, and we've got Sawsan, who is, I think, in London. And it's a talk about, as I said, child detention in Palestine. And this is part 2 of our coverage of that issue, of the treatment of Palestinian children in Israeli detention. We are collectively Hexham Labour Friends of Palestine, and we're working in close partnership with Newcastle Labour Friends of Palestine. I'll be introducing you to Anne, who is chair of that in a minute, and with Newcastle Palestine Solidarity Campaign, from where we've got Steve Waters there. Katie Osborne and I are from Hexham Labour Friends of Palestine. The talk will be introduced by Anne, who is chair of Newcastle Labour Friends of Palestine, as I say, and also a Newcastle City Councillor. And she'll be introducing our 2 guest speakers. The session's going to run for about an hour, and there's a Q&A session at the end of the speeches. Okay, I think I'll hand you over to Anne now, who's going to introduce the speakers.
Well, good evening, everybody, and welcome to the second part of our discussion on Palestinian child prisoners. What we always do is to send a message of solidarity and friendship to the people of Palestine. We know Israel prosecutes between 500 and 700 Palestinian children in military courts each year, but in doing so, they are bound by the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, which was ratified by Israel in 1991. This convention recognizes of childhood as a crucial time for growth and development. It also recognized childhood as a time when children need protection and they are vulnerable. So by ratifying the convention, the Israeli government committed to providing children, all children, with a safe childhood, with care, protection, and opportunities that needed to ensure their childhood is a time free from insecurity, violence, and abuse. Well, since 2000, an estimated 10,000 Palestinian children have been detained by Israeli forces from the occupied West Bank and held in the Israeli military detention system. Now, Israel has the dubious distinction of being the only country in the world that automatically and systematically prosecutes Palestinian children in military courts that lack fundamental fair trial rights and protections. And according to the UNICEF report, Children in Israel Detention Observation and Recommendation, ill treatment in the Israeli military system remains widespread, systematic, and institutionalized throughout the process. So last week, we heard from Salwa and Gerard from Military Court Watch on the importance of location in the arrest of Palestinian children, namely that around 98% are arrested just over half a mile from a settlement or a road only available to settlers. We then heard from them on the details of the arrests, interrogations and detentions, and how Israel is breaking the 1989 Convention on the Rights of the Child and other conventions, such as the 4th Geneva Convention and the Convention Against Torture and other cruel or inhuman degrading treatments, including punishments. So tonight we're very fortunate. We're going to have an update which includes a film on the Palestinian child prisoners and the treatment of child detainees under military courts and in prison. And before I introduce our speakers though to this very important discussion, I just would like to say, as we did last week, that this topic is very, very distressing for many people. And we expect everyone who attends, especially our speakers, to be treated with respect throughout the evening. And this includes chat, where questions are really welcome, but any offensive comments or questions will not be allowed at any point. So I'd now like to just hand over to our first speaker, someone who is going to say a few brief words and then introduce the film. Someone is here as a part of the DCI in the UK, which we're all really keen to hear about. It'd be very important. And we're really keen to hear about new policy recommendations. So over to you, Sawsan. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Anne. So my name is Sawsan. I'm the UK Advocacy Officer at DCI Palestine. I've worked at DCI on and off for about 9 years, but I returned earlier this year after a 4-year absence. So it's really good to be back, and I'm very happy to say that we've finally launched in the UK. So up until now, we've been delivering some activities in the UK with support from local groups, local labour groups, local PSC groups, other organisations, but we'd never had a permanent presence in the UK, and we do now. So that's really exciting, and I'll talk a bit more about that at the end as well. I should also apologise, my voice is a little bit hoarse, so I hope that's not too grating. So as Anne mentioned, as you may already be aware, Israel is the only country in the world that automatically and systematically prosecutes Palestinian children in military courts that lack fundamental fair trial rights and protections. We estimate that Israeli military authorities detained, interrogated, prosecuted, and imprisoned about 13,000 Palestinian children since the year 2000. Since 1967, Israel has operated 2 separate legal systems within the same territory. So in the occupied West Bank, Israeli settlers are subject to the civilian and criminal legal system, whereas Palestinians are subjected to Israeli military law. In East Jerusalem, Palestinian children are subjected to civilian criminal law. Israeli children, even those residing in illegal Israeli settlements in the occupied Palestinian territory, don't come into contact with the military court and detention system. So usually children must appear before a military court judge within 24 to 96 hours after their arrest. For most of them, this is the first time that they've seen their lawyer or a family member. The Israeli military detention system does not allow children to have a lawyer present before or after before or during an interrogation. Many children maintain their innocence, but they ultimately plead guilty, as this is the fastest way to get out of the system. Trials, on the other hand, can last a year, possibly longer, during which children remain behind bars, as the military courts deny bail in the majority of cases. Israeli authorities transfer nearly 60% of Palestinian child detainees from the occupied Palestinian territory to prisons inside Israel, which is a violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. One of the practical consequences of this is that children have limited or no family visits, as Palestinians often struggle to obtain permits to enter Israel. Between January 2014 and December 2019, we collected affidavits from 752 child detainees, which described their arrest, interrogation, and detention experiences. Of these, over half of children said they were arrested at night. 87% were not informed of the reason for their arrest. 95% had their hands and feet bound, and 84% were blindfolded. 72% were subjected to physical violence, and 61% to verbal abuse, humiliation, or intimidation. 48% were transferred from the place of their arrest on the floor of a vehicle. 3/4 were strip searched. 46% were denied food and water, and 32% were denied access to a toilet. During interrogations, 70% of children were improperly informed of their rights, like their right to silence. 96% were interrogated without a family member present. Half of children were shown or made to sign a paper in Hebrew, which is a language that most Palestinian children do not understand, and 35% were threatened or coerced. Since 2016, at least 108 Palestinian children have been held in solitary confinement. Children were held on average for a period of 14 days. 43 children endured a prolonged period of isolation of 16 or more days. The longest documented period of isolation during this time was 30 days. While in isolation, these children experienced minimal human contact, and they commonly report significantly worse cell conditions than in other periods of their detention. Evidence collected by DCIP overwhelmingly indicates that it's practiced solely to obtain a confession for a specific offence or to gather intelligence under interrogation. We found no evidence of the legally justifiable use of solitary confinement against Palestinian children. So international law prohibits the use of solitary confinement and other practices, which constitutes cruel, inhuman, or degrading treatment against children. The practice of solitary confinement, in addition to corporal punishment, placement in a dark cell, or any other punishment that may compromise the physical or mental health of the child, may, in some cases, amount to torture. In 2015, following a 3-year suspension of the practice, Israeli authorities also began arresting and detaining children under administrative detention orders. Administrative detention is a form of imprisonment without charge or trial. So children are held under these orders and never presented with charges, and the detention is based on secret evidence that is never disclosed to them or their attorney. So neither they nor their attorney have any legal means of challenging the detention, which amounts to a denial of a fundamental due process right. According to the Israel Prison Service, an average of 2 Palestinian children are held under administrative detention orders every month. Of course, the global spread of COVID-19 has introduced a new set of circumstances within which children are being detained. In August, we confirmed the first case of a Palestinian child detainee in Israeli custody who was infected with COVID-19. Israeli forces arrested the 15-year-old boy at his home in Al Jalazun refugee camp, north of the central occupied West Bank city of Ramallah on July 23rd. At the end of September, we confirmed that a second Palestinian child tested positive for coronavirus while in the Israeli military detention system. The 14-year-old boy tested positive after spending just 2 days in Israeli custody. It's as yet unknown if he contracted the virus prior to his detention or while he was in custody. Our documentation shows that Palestinian children in the military detention system live in close proximity to each other, often in compromised sanitary conditions, so they typically have little or no access to resources with which to maintain basic hygiene practices, including practices that reduce the spread of COVID-19. On March 19th, we called on Israeli authorities to immediately release all Palestinian child detainees in Israeli prisons, but Israeli authorities have continued detaining Palestinian children. At the end of August, 153 Palestinian children were detained in Israeli prisons and detention centres. And if you'd like to take action in relation to COVID-19, you can sign our petition calling for the release of all Palestinian child prisoners in light of COVID-19 on our website, which is dci-palestine.org. But right now we're going to watch one of our films, which is Abida, which will perhaps illustrate a little better than I can some of what I've been talking about so far. That works.
أنا عبيد أكرم جواد، مخيم العروب، شمال الخليل، عمري تقريبا 15 سنة وبحب أطبخ. عندك مخيم العروب كله دور صغيرة وعدد الأفراد اللي فيها كبير كثير ومساحة الدور صغيرة، حتى إنه الشباك مثلا فتح على شباك جارك، يعني الحد في الحد زي ما يسموها. عندك توك صغيرة، عندك برضو الناس فيها كثير طيبين، كثير مناح، جدعان، وقفوا معك المشاكل. فيش حياة الأطفال مأساوية، لا في ألعاب زي العالم، لا في حرية. تم اعتقالي مرتين من قبل الاحتلال. عندي كانت تجربة أولى مأساوية جدا، حتى كنت أنا ماشي أروح على الدكان أشتري، اعتقلوني. لما اعتقلوني في مركز التحقيق حطوا لي كلبش بلاستيك، كلبشتين نفس الشيء في نفس الإيد، حتى كان بقدرش حركة إيدي لا لفوق ولا لتحت. كان حطوا لي عصب خميلة وحتى حطوها لمنخار، يعني ما قدرتش أتنفس بصعوبة. تعرف لما تمشي أنت مش شايف إشي، طريق غريب، ظلك ماشي ظلك في شيء دايخ وخايف ومتردد. حتى هم كانوا يقول لي انزل الدرج، ما بقاش في درج، بقول ارفع رجلك خلوني اقع. بس طبعا كان ما يضربش الا على المناطق الغير حساسه، حتى ما تشهدش ضدهم او تثبتش اشاره ضدهم. صار في اشياء كثير. لما قلت السجن وروحت شفت اشياء كثير متغيره. لما رجعت كانت المواد كلها متراكمه جدا علي، حتى انه ما عرفتش لا اختار لا هذا ولا هذا.
هاي مثلا ترتبها شويه هيك، لان في عندنا انواع يتم تشكيلها بالبطول، في عندنا انواع بالفساد بالعقل، كويس؟ هاي مثلا نوع من انواع النبات يتم تشكيله ايش؟ من خلال النبت نفسه. في عندنا التكاثر الجنسي وفي عندنا التكاثر اللا جنسي، كويس؟
رحت على الصناعيه عشان المواد برضو كانت متراكمه جدا، وعملوا لي امتحانات شهرين فتغلبت كثير. كنت كل يوم بقيت اقرا كل كتاب.
لما تشعر شو تعمل؟ تبعد ايدك 2 ميلي،
اجيب علامات عاليه انه اثبت وجود انه ما راحش تعبكم وهيك، ما راحش انكم قبلتوني راح تاثر علي في النفسيه.
انا رشيد عرار، المرشد المهني لمدرسه العروب الزراعيه. وزي ما احنا شايفين هون هذا الشارع شارع 60 اللي بمر منه كثير من المستوطنين اللي بيعملوا لنا اشكاليه كبيره في هذا المكان، لانه احنا موجودين على
ايش هذا الصوت؟
هذا الجرس. احنا موجودين على منطقه احتكاك بيؤدي لانه مرات يصير في اعتداءات من قبل قوات الاحتلال على الاطفال، اعتقالات، مداهمات للمدرسه. الاطفال اول ما بيجوا سواء كان معتقل قبل ما يجي عندنا او بيتم اعتقاله عندنا وبعدين بيلتحق بالمدرسه، بنجد انه في صعوبه اثناء دمجه مع الطلاب، يعني مش بالسهل انه يتفاعل، مش بالسهل انه يبني علاقات، مش بالسهل انه يبني صداقات، مرات عنده ردات فعل مش محسوبه. هذا الموضوع بيشتغل عليه على انه نعيده لتوازن، نعيده لانه يرجع يندمج مع الاطفال، يبني علاقات، ينتظم بالمدرسه، يتخلص من بعض السلوكيات اللي شوي بتاثر عليه من ناحيه سلبيه.
بلاش نفكر ليش احنا غير عن اطفال العالم، ليش بس تعيين فلسطين بروحوا بتسجلوا اعمارهم صغيره بينتهكوا في الحياه وهم غير مبسوطين، بيروحوا على جيم، على كره سله، على تدريبات، عندهم امكانيات كثير احسن منا. انت قارن كيف ليش هم هيك واحنا هيك؟ هذا السؤال لحد الان ما حدا جاوب عليه. ليش رحت الزراعة الكلية؟ نبات عشان الحيوان وعندنا في علاقات هذول. أنا تعرف إيش رحت؟ عشان أسرد المواد العلمية، فيزياء وكيمياء وأحياء، صعوبات كثير. أنا سرعت منها. ومنيح الزراعة، يعني وظيفة محترمة ورا مكتب وتشتغل لحالك وقائد نفسك. أنا هذا الشيء اللي بحبه. بدك تشتغل ورا مكتب بعدين داوم عليك، سوي هيك سوي هيك، وقلت نفسك أحسن. صحيح. لما كنا جوا بس نفكر، بس يوم نطلع محكمة عشان هيك نضيع وقت. الزراعة محكمة. الزراعة. جينا نشوف بلد غير مصر. بلد هو يوم للزيارات، يوم للزيارة تشوف أهلك. هاي الأشياء المنيحة في السجن. الشيء منيح هو، بس في أشياء بتعلمك إنه زي الصبر في الامتناع، زي تصبر، تنظم حالك. أنت مروض بالسجن جوا شوف تعبد علمت الطبخ، حفظي الشاب علمت الطبخ. وعندنا كان جابوا شيف من الأقسام الثانية إنه أطلع 3-2 معهم اسم مساعد الطباخ، فاشتغلنا معه وعلمنا شغلة. تعلمت مهارة الطبخ، وتعلمت مهارة التعامل مع الناس، الأدب، الاحترام. بحس حالي حر، بس مش الحرية التامة. عندك لازم أول شيء تتحرك عشان أحس حالي حر تماما، بس برضه في عندك إنك حر تطلع وقت ما بدك، تيجي وقت ما بدك، في التاكسي تحكي ما بدك، تزعل ما بدك. كان عندك خلاص إرادة شخصية، شو بدك تسوي. أنا هذا كنت مفتقده جوا، بس واحد مش متحرك كيف بدي أعيش الفرح تمام 100%، يعني حتى جزء من فرحك تمام.
Thank you, Chris. So I hope that somewhat illustrated the experiences of a child. We have a lot more videos on our YouTube channel that go into the experiences of children who've been detained in solitary confinement, for example, or under administrative detention orders. So I'd encourage you to go and watch those as well. So perhaps now I'll talk a little bit about the kind of the way in which we talk about Palestinian child detainees, how we frame that, and how you might usefully also frame that, particularly if you're trying to engage the Labour Party, or if you're trying to engage your MP, for example. So we believe that in no circumstances should children be detained or prosecuted under the jurisdiction of military courts, but as a minimum safeguard while Palestinian children continue to be arrested and prosecuted within the Israeli military court and detention system, Israeli authorities must respect and ensure basic due process rights and the absolute prohibition against torture and ill treatment. From the moment of arrest, operations and procedures have to be carried out in accordance with international juvenile justice standards, specifically the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, or CRC, which Anne mentioned earlier. Including, detention must only be used as a last resort and only for the shortest appropriate time. Children must not be subjected to physical or psychological violence. Children must have access to legal consultation and parents prior to and during interrogations. Children must only be arrested during daylight hours. Children must be properly informed of their right to silence. They must not be blindfolded or painfully restrained. They must not be subjected to coercive force or threats, and all interrogations must be audio-visually recorded. Any incriminating evidence obtained during an interrogation where a child was not properly and effectively informed of their right to silence must be excluded by courts. Any statement made as a result of torture or ill treatment must be excluded as evidence in any proceeding, and the practice of using solitary confinement on children in the Israeli military detention system, whether in pre-trial detention for interrogation purposes or as a form of punishment, must be stopped immediately, and the prohibition must be enshrined in law. The practice of using administrative detention orders against Palestinian children must also stop immediately, and the prohibition must be enshrined in law. All credible allegations of torture and ill treatment must be thoroughly and impartially investigated in accordance with international standards, and the perpetrators brought promptly to justice. And finally, children must not be transferred out of the West Bank in violation of the Fourth Geneva Convention. So what do? Our legal unit provides free legal representation to Palestinian children detained and prosecuted in the Israeli legal system, including the military court and detention system. Our socio-legal defence unit ensures that children have access to support through our own social workers, who provide preliminary individual and group psychosocial interventions. We also deliver advocacy campaigns in the US, Canada, UK, and at the EU. Chief among these is our campaign, No Way to Treat a Child, which aims to challenge and end Israel's prolonged military occupation by exposing widespread and systematic ill treatment of Palestinian children in the Israeli military detention system. So in 2015, DCI established a full-time presence in the US and launched the campaign with the American Friends Service Committee. The campaign aims to influence the public's understanding of the issue in addition to delivering congressional advocacy activities. Recently, we marked a historic moment when on April 30th, 2019, Representative Betty McCollum, with support from us, introduced Promoting Human Rights for Palestinian Children Living Under Israeli Military Occupation Act, which is a mouthful, also known as HR 2407. And HR 2407 prohibits US taxpayer funding for the military detention of children by any country, including Israel. So things that you can do. You can, if you're in the UK, which I assume most of you are, you can subscribe to receive emails from us about the No Way to Treat a Child campaign and the activities that we're about to launch in the UK, which is incredibly exciting. So if you go to our website, dci-palestine.org, and you enter your email address and you give us a postcode, then you'll receive information about webinars, local events and actions that you can take nationally, but also specific to your constituency. So I'd really encourage you to do that. Also to follow us on Facebook and Twitter as well for action alerts. And another thing that the organisers of this talk mentioned to me that would be useful what might be useful to you is if I gave an overview of the legal context within which we challenge Israel. So a good starting principle is that regardless of guilt or innocence, children in conflict with the law are entitled to special protections and all due process rights under international human rights law. International juvenile justice norms are built on two fundamental principles. The best interest of the child must be a primary concern in making decisions that affect them, and children must only be deprived of their liberty as a last resort for the shortest appropriate period of time. International human rights law affirms that juvenile justice systems must be child-sensitive, non-violent, and avoid criminalization and punishment of children. Specifically, international human rights law obligates states to create a distinct juvenile justice system that recognizes the special status of children. International legal protections for children related to juvenile justice are contained primarily in the CRC, which Anne mentioned before, which is the most widely ratified international human rights treaty in history. And as she mentioned, in 1991, Israel ratified the CRC. International human rights law does apply in the occupied Palestinian territory, including the CRC, the Convention Against Torture, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. These human rights treaties generally provide that in all actions involving or impacting children, the best interests of the child shall be a primary consideration. All persons are entitled to a fair and public hearing by competent, independent, and impartial tribunal, and torture and ill treatment are absolutely prohibited without exception. Unfortunately, despite various degrees of engagement by UN bodies, including the Committee on the Rights of the Child, the Committee Against Torture, the UN Working Group on Arbitrary Detention, as well as a special representative of the Secretary General on Children and Armed Conflict, Israeli authorities have persistently failed to implement practical changes to end its unlawful practices towards Palestinian children. I will leave it there for now, and I will allow Anne to introduce Sahar. But if you have any questions, then please come back to me in the Q&A.
Sawsan, that was just so informative, and I just feel the film said so much that you could almost not put into words. So thank you for both of those, because you do need both. We need the information, we need the facts, but that film, the power of it for that child, or two children, wasn't it really? It says so much about the rights of a child. And he just seems to have done well because he's been surrounded by people who really wanted to make him come through the situation. But so I'm really, really grateful. And I think there will be questions, and I'm really interested to hear more about H4207 at some point, but I won't bother you with that now because there'll be lots of others. And just really to take the opportunity to, where are you? To introduce Sahar. And again, Sahar, we're really very pleased to have you with us this evening. I've actually visited your office, so it feels very good to me as well. But really, for you to be able to tell us in detail just what's actually happening to the Palestinian child detainees. And I was particularly interested about the whole COVID situation. And if they've got anything on that, that would be great. But really, over to you, and thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne, and thank you all for this initiative. I think it's really very, very important to cover the situation of the Palestinian children, especially now under the COVID circumstances, because it was really so worrying and amazing how the Israeli occupation forces didn't took the issue of the COVID in relation and acted accordingly, especially according to what the UN, the High Commissioner Office, issued at the beginning of the spread of the COVID, that authorities should release prisoners, especially those that they are in risk, whether to be affected by the COVID, like physically or mentally. And imagine a child that he would be arrested and sent for quarantine for 1 month or 40 days, totally disconnected, how much impact would leave such an experience on him. So Israel was totally ignoring all these recommendations and circumstances. The mass arrest campaigns, not just against children, but against Palestinian adults as well, is continuing, irrelevant to the COVID situation. Addameer with DCI, with other Palestinian human rights organizations, we were following the situation of the children in the prisons under the COVID. We petitioned the Israeli High Court at the beginning of the first month, actually, of the COVID, because the Israeli prison system totally canceled all the family visits. And they were really totally disconnected because also lawyers were not able to visit. And there was an agreement from a year before that children should have access for phone calls to contact their families. You know that all the Palestinian prisoners are not enabled to call their families. And when there's no family visits, they literally are totally disconnected. So the High Court confirmed that the prison system should enable these children to call their families. They implemented it just in Addameer. The children were distributed in 3 prisons inside. All of them, they are inside, like except Ofer, of course, which is located in the occupied territory, but still they impose on families to have military permits to go to Ofer. So they were enabling the children in Addameer to call their families. It took us several court sessions in order to get to the stage where all the children were at least enabled to phone call their families once. Then the family visits were reactivated, but still it was again restricted after the lockdown in Israel in the last 3 weeks. And some of the cases that Sawsan mentioned, that children were tested positive inside the prison, the problem was with those that they were arrested in order to be sent for interrogation. We followed a case of a child from Jalazon refugee camp near Ramallah, that he was tested very soon after his detention positive. He was sent for the quarantine in Rimon prison. It's in the south. He was totally isolated in his cell without anything, no TV, nothing in his cell, himself and the bed. And the guy was freaking out. Every time we met him in the video conference in the court sessions and his mother was there, he was starting to shout, yelling, screaming, and he was not interrogated. And all the accusation against him was that he was involved in throwing stones in the refugee camp. He was tested 4 times. 4 times he was positive. So he was kept all the time in quarantine for more than 1 month. At the end, and all the time we were appealing to the court to release him, like let him be freed with his family under this situation of being positive to the COVID. Later on, he will surrender himself and he would be imprisoned, and they refused. When they submitted the charge sheet, it was such a ridiculous one that the court at the end decided to release him on bail. So you would wonder why they kept a child in such circumstances under such a threat of being like mentally seriously affected. And honestly, after this child refused to meet Addameer field researchers, we tried to meet him with a psychologist to help him and to bring the testimony about the impact of the COVID and the quarantine on him, and he refused. So I think this boy really was affected, and he still suffers from the impact of the experience of the harsh imprisonment. Actually, I would be just focusing on the several cases that we followed in the last 2-3 months that reflects perfectly what Sawsan was describing and what the video highlighted, whether in the use of the administrative detention, the solitary confinement, the torture, and the fact that they also use like health conditions as a pressuring situation on the child detainees under interrogation. So one of the cases that we were following in the last couple of weeks, a boy that he was arrested from Beit Lahem area, and he was interrogated in Ashkelon Interrogation Center. He was interrogated for, like, first he was banned lawyer meeting, like it's also applicable for the children that under interrogation, they can ban them from meeting their lawyer for up to 20 days. So it means they would be totally isolated, facing just the interrogation and the pressure of the interrogators. This guy was interrogated every day for at least 1 week at the beginning for 15 continuous hours. And you can imagine that while he's under interrogation, he would be tied to the chair, handcuffed, and the 6 interrogators were interrogating him at one time, and they were shouting, screaming, yelling on him. One of them, he was hitting him on the face. and they were turning off the condition for very cold. So the boy was feeling very cold under the interrogation, and his interrogation lasted for around 30 days before he was brought to be charged in the court. We had another case of a boy that he's from the same refugee camp as Ubaida from Al Arub, and seriously, this refugee camp is very problematic with this street number 60, where there's usually like clashes with the settlers and the army over claims of throwing stones on the bypass road. This boy Salim was arrested 4 days after he got a surgery on the back, and he was hospitalized in one of the Palestinian hospitals in Jericho. And he was transferred to the Hadassah hospital. While in the transfer, one of the soldiers hit him on the surgery on his back. He was treated in Hadassah and went back to the Russian compound to be interrogated. And the same soldier, when they reached the Russian compound, he was beating him again before he was entering to the detention facility. In the Russian compound, he was strip searched before he was taken to the clinic as well. And then they started interrogating him. So this pressure on the health, on the surgery, actually is aiming to put pressure on the child so he easily can confess, can say anything, just in order to get rid of the pressure that he's facing under interrogation. 2 days ago, another boy from Birzeit area was arrested. He's 16 years old. This boy, actually, Amal, he was wanted for the last 3 months because there is a confession against him that he was involved in throwing stones. And the family reached Addameer to inform us that the boy has a very serious problem with the lungs. Actually, he has a chronic disease, myasthenia gravis, something that is affecting his nerves and immune system. And out of this illness, he developed some problem in the lung that they suspected that he has a cancer. So he got a surgery in Jerusalem. He was denied permit to go to Jerusalem. So the family, of course, managed to snake him into Jerusalem, and he did the surgery. After the surgery, they came to the house several times to arrest him, and we were interfering and requesting that they cannot arrest him under such circumstances. 2 days before, they arrested him from the street, and they took him immediately to the detention center in Ofer without allowing him to go back to the home to get his medication at least. For the last 2 days, we were struggling with the system in order to enable the family to bring the medication, because the medications that he's in need, if he stopped taking them for a couple of days, he would be in a very serious problem. Today, we managed to get a report by an Israeli doctor to convince the prison system, and they said, okay, the family can bring the medication. And the boy is just suspected of throwing stones. And I'm sure that they are aware, because already today the prosecution, the military prosecution, informed us that they are thinking about sending him to administrative detention. Like, again, in every case where they fail to prove the charges, or they can prove that it's a very serious security threat, so the court will keep the child in detention, they will go and use the administrative detention in order to cover the failure of the evidences and to keep the detainee in as long as they can. hopefully in this case, because of the medical situation, we can make difference and we can, but it's too early to decide now because they didn't finish interrogating him, and they didn't decided yet whether to charge or to go to the option of the administrative detention. Another case of a boy from Qalandia refugee camp, Sliman. Sliman, this is actually, he was arrested in the 21st of October, and this is the third time that Sliman is arrested in the last 2 years. The first time Sliman was arrested was a year after the death of his old brother. And he was writing something in his Facebook page in the memory of his brother, saying how much he missed him and how much he's looking for meeting him. So the elaboration of the security was that the guy is planning to have a militant attack. So he would be killed and he would be meeting his brother. So they came, they arrested him, and they charged him with incitement. We managed to release Sliman on bail. So in the same day, they issued a 4-month administrative detention against Sliman. And in the same time, we kept hearing the case of the incitement. And the administrative detention was extended for another 3 months. Sliman was kept in administrative detention for 7 months. And then he was really finishing as well. They agreed that the sentence would be the same period that he already spent in administrative detention. Sliman was released after 4 months or less. His sister was arrested, a student in Birzeit University, because lately they are attacking specifically the students in Birzeit University. She was tortured in the Russian compound. In the time of her interrogation, they arrested Sliman and brought him to the interrogation center. So to pressure the sister that here we arrested your young boy, young brother, and if you don't confess, we will keep him in detention and we will torture him as well. And then instead of releasing him, they sent him again for another 4 months in administrative detention. And he was released at the beginning of 2020 to be rearrested in October. And this is also reflects how these children could be facing continuous, even whenever you are arrested once, it can follow you for long, long years. And this is how actually the aim of targeting so many children is aiming to target a whole generation at the end of the day, and to affect a whole generation in the Palestinian society. It's not just, really, if you check what these children would be involved in, it's not so serious activities that can justify such harsh treatment, torture, and all the other violations that they face. I will end up with another case that it was so terrible, where the army in the village of Deir Abu Mish'al shooted toward 3 children. They killed 1 and injured two others. And it was in August this year. Last 2 weeks, they arrested these 2 kids that they were injured in this activity. The army claimed that the 3 of them tried to put a bomb on the street. The bomb was 2 car tires and a gas bomb. Today, they brought to the court a cutted video that shows the 3 kids running on the street. There's no evidence that they really used a gas bomb or anything like this. But they are facing now a charge of a attempt to explode a bomb on the street, and by this threatening the security. In the same time, we represent one case, another lawyer represents the other guy. The prosecution offered for the other boy that he's injured in his feet by 3 bullets, that like we can agree to change the charge sheet and to accept a sentence of the period that you already spent, like less than 1 month. They were arrested on the 15th of October, and a fine of 1,000 shekel, and that's all. And we're arguing, but what these children did, why they should end up with a plea bargain instead, like, because, you know, if you want to hear the case till the end, it can take months before exhausting all of the evidences in the military court procedures. So then you have to think about whether to keep this child in detention till the end of the trial, and then he will spend 3-4 months or whatever, or you go for the plea bargain and you accept to be charged with threatening the security and then paying 1,000 fine and being released. And the guy, the other child, was sentenced today. We hope that we can release the other, his name is Ahmed, with conditions. I'm not hopeful that the appeal court will agree to release him, especially that the other guy was sentenced today. But we're trying to argue that these children were not supposed to be arrested at all, because you don't have enough evidences to claim that they really did something wrong. But the problem in the military court, that you would have the saying of the child versus the 3 soldiers or whatever, that they will confess that they saw them putting a tire. And the court, of course, will take seriously the soldiers' testimonies, and they will not acquit these children. And this is a risk, to have a child spending 1 year or 7 months or 8 months for such activity in prison. So I mean, these cases reflects the difficulties that these children face in the military system, in the prison, in the interrogation centers. The dilemma of us as lawyers dealing with these difficult cases, in between trying to show that the whole system is discriminating, is not respecting international standards of fair trial, and still protecting and trying to help these children to get through very fast all these difficult circumstances. I think MPs have a serious role in trying, the Labour Party, I believe, you should pressure Israel and push them to really stop administrative detention, definitely against children, but not just against children. Stop the prosecution in military courts for children. And I would remind you with the recommendations that the UK report that was issued in 2012, actually, by different UK lawyers and judges, that they were visiting the military court, and they came up with their report with around 40 recommendations. None of these recommendations were respected by the Israeli side. The opposite, they refused to accept the following visit coming from the same group that visited the military court back in 2012. Thank you.
Sahar, thank you for that. It doesn't matter how many times one hears the stories, the horror is still there. And what you've produced today is just within the framework of COVID as well, and the cruelty. I mean, we don't use the word cruelty as a description. What we use it as is to say something is very wrong. And what you and Sawsan have said today and shown through the film is that what they are doing to children is wrong. There isn't a discussion about it. There isn't. It's just wrong. And I do agree with you about the responsibility we have to try and work with our government and within those of us who are within the Labour Party and those who are outside it, really, to try to make a difference there. And so that's why it's so great to have you in the UK, Sawsan. I think that helps us enormously. But I really do think what you've put before us today is something that we can't leave. These are children, they have a right to a childhood, they have a right to protection, and all the law says that. And the violation of those laws and conventions is just something that we have a responsibility to take on, I think. And you've made that very clear to us, both of you. So what I think now is we'll hand over to questions. And Chris, I'm going to hand over to you. I'm actually speaking tonight on children in the UK who are starving. And it feels to me I'm going to go with my head filled with this, and I could very easily end up talking about Palestinian children. So I'll have to be very careful when I speak. But again, the point is that children have a right to be protected and looked after and nourished and be warm, and all the things that you've shown us are not there. So I'm very, very sorry that I've got to leave, but I'll hand over to Chris, and I'll look forward to being in touch with you both again and to hearing the questions later. So Chris, thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you. Thank you both, and Sawsan and Sahar. Very, very grateful for that eye-widening report from both of you. We've got a couple of questions here. Thank you, Katie. We've got one from Steve to Sawsan. What is the petition requesting? You may have seen these, of course, because they're on the chat. Requesting where it is on the, and you've answered that, Sawsan, already.
Yes, I've shared the link.
Oh, okay. So Katie has a question. So are there currently any mental health services, very pertinent, available for detained children upon release? I think I know the answer to this, actually. Either to answer that, if you wouldn't mind.
We have social workers that provide psychosocial support to children, both individually and as a group. In addition to that, we have on our website in the past published a few articles, a few news alerts or features about reintegration into school, for example, or into the community, and the isolation and the trauma that results from military detention of any kind, but particularly from solitary confinement. And in those, there is some mention of, for example, if children access mental health services at a local community centre or wherever. So they do exist.
Okay, thank you, Sawsan. I'm quite surprised to hear that.
But can I add to that very quickly? I would say that there is quite a lot of informal support that happens, or sort of unrecognised support that happens. Families, other children who have been incarcerated, teachers as well, because this is so widespread and such a common experience, especially amongst teenage boys. There is a lot of kind of informal and unrecognised sort of mental health, psychosocial, psychological support that is happening all the time, really.
Okay, thank you very much for that. This is all good stuff for the video, by the way, because we've got so much to take in and act upon. It's very good that we've got a recording of this. Now, I had a question from Ed, which I more or less duplicated myself. But Ed is asking, how much do the Israeli population know about what you've been speaking about? And do they protest or oppose it?
If I may take this one, I think they are aware, but as they are aware for all the violations of the occupation, not all of course, the majority of the Israeli public choose not to see, to ignore, and not to be active. But specifically on the child detainees issues, there is a group that was initiated lately inside Israel called the family parents of child detainees, and they are trying to talk more about the cases of Palestinian children in detention and to protest, but they are a small group, so they are not so effective, and they were supportive in the petition that I described with Hammoukade Center, with the Committee Against Torture, with the Association for Human Rights inside Israel, Addameer, Adala, and other human rights organizations. But so far, I don't think they managed to cause a difference in the Israeli public in a way that it's really affecting the policies toward the child detainees, or in the level of changing the laws that happened in the last 2 years inside Israel concerning actually the deterioration. It's not for good. It was for bad that they increased sentences and they changed the Israeli criminal code to be fitting the military procedures actually and the military sentences for throwing stones and other crimes.
Thank you very much for that, Sahar. Ed went on to ask, and I was wanting to ask this too actually, do the Israeli authorities think their policies are having an effect? For example, has the incidence of children throwing stones, which I'm quite sure most of us here find a pretty pathetic excuse for arresting a child, but is it having an effect on the Palestinian population?
I expect both of us will have something to say, but I can go first. So it is having the effect of very successfully and effectively continuing the policy of occupation. Because, of course, under international law, as the occupying power, Israel does have the right to establish these military courts. It's how they administer them, which is, presents numerous violations of those same laws. But while those military courts and while this military detention system remains, one cannot really talk about, ending occupation. It is one of the prime vehicles through which Israel maintains effectively an occupation, and that includes the kind of chilling effect for the population, the traumatizing, as Sahar mentioned earlier, of generations of children, turning children into political prisoners and so on. So it's having numerous complex effects on the Palestinian population, but it is being fairly successful in maintaining occupation as sort of one of its constituent parts. Really, is this system of automatically prosecuting children in this way.
So, Sahar, would you like to add to that?
Just shortly, I think in general, the issue of imprisonment, the policies of the imprisonment, the torture, and the impact of such experience, not just on children, but in every person who get to be imprisoned, is so serious. And the aim is really to silence everyone that is trying to speak, to be active, because if we take the increase in attacking even children that they dare to write posts on their Facebook or to share a poster or a picture of their relative that was killed by the Israelis, then they would be imprisoned for incitement. The aim is to make us fear any kind of activity against the occupation. So I think, yeah, this is why they are keep using it and expanding it actually. From their point of view, this is the only way how to silence and to oppress and control more and more the Palestinian society, including the children.
Mm-hmm. I would add to that as well that in terms of the domestic access to accountability, of course, the kind of any Israeli mechanism, kind of complaint mechanism that we've ever attempted to engage with in terms of, for example, filing complaints on behalf of children that have reported ill treatment or torture. Of course, no indictments are filed. That doesn't go anywhere. But even if they you know, even if people did actually have any sort of faith in them, which they don't, a lot of families have told us that they fear actually filing complaints or allowing their children to file complaints because there might be some sort of punitive measure taken against them, that they might then put themselves at risk of more violence or more arrests and so on. So people are very fearful. Oh, you're still muted, Chris.
Oh, sorry. I said I hesitate to say, but, which I did hesitate to say, that it just sounds like state terror to me. However, we have one or two more questions here. One from Sue, and she's asking, you know, how can we support you financially? Are there any ways we can raise funds to support your work? Or are there any other ways we can offer support?
For us, it's a bit complicated, all the issue of public fundraising, because we are not allowed to have any international bank account, and money transfer for Addameer should be just done through local Palestinian banks. This is one difference from the DCI. We as an organization, we are facing lots of attacks lately, and like smear campaign trying to shut down our work actually. So any kind of support for the issue of prisoners would be very helpful. And I'm sure any support for the DCI as well would be very needed and very helpful. And for us, really the efforts to expose more the situation of the child detainees and the problems of the military system, using the military system against Palestinian children would be very supportive.
Yes, and for us, you can donate through our website. And if you're in the UK, you should receive an email from us now that we're sort of launching this month. Finally, you'll receive an email from us probably towards the end of this month, early next month, asking you to donate to fund our work. And in that email, in response to another question that somebody has asked, we'll outline all of the really exciting things that we have planned for 2021. But also for both Addameer and for DCI, something that you can do that is enormously helpful is sharing the work that we produce. So sharing our content, you know, raising awareness, and you know, if you're using social media, follow us on social media, try to amplify the work that we're both doing.
Well, we'll certainly be doing that. Final question from Maggie, who asks, is there any stigma in seeking support for mental health support, particularly among young men?
I think Sahar could probably answer this better than me because I'm Egyptian and not Palestinian, so perhaps Sahar can speak more about Palestinian society.
I should say it's better in these like a couple of years before, like it used to be in the maybe the 80s, the early 90s, where not just for the young men, in general, prisoners were very hesitant about seeking mental support out of this stigma that they are heroes and they are not weak, they are not allowed to show this weakness. But I think in the last decade, where there is more opening for the psychological support and the need for the psychological support, there's more involvement for organizations like a DCI, like the special programs within the YMCA and Save the Children for ex-prisoners and especially child prisoners when it comes for psychological support. So I would say that it depends a lot as well from where you're coming. In more areas where it's still very, I would say, close family relations, that the family would play this role of support, and they were not, maybe they would be hesitant to go to seek the support from the outside. But in areas like Beit Lahem, Ramallah, Nablus, more the cities, no, it's more accepted, I would say.
Okay. Well, I think we've done. If anyone has any further questions, as I said earlier, you can post them on the Facebook page, and I hope you've got the links that we set down in the chat. Anyone who wants to get in touch and didn't pick up the links or can't remember something or other, you can get in touch with us through Hexham CLP website. Okay, I think we're done. And it remains to say again, we're so grateful, and we hope you keep in touch, Sawsan and Sahar. And again, thank you so much. And we'll make this video available to everyone, including you, if you want to go through it and use bits of it again. Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye.
Good night. Thanks for coming. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.